Hello, and welcome to this recorded interview on Minerva Analytics' recently published briefing on defence. This discussion will examine some of the key findings of the briefing. This includes whether defence investments are compatible with ESG practices, misconceptions around the impact of regulations on defence, and key considerations for institutional investors when it comes to defence. I'm Grogan-Fenn, newsletter editor at Minerva Analytics. I am joined by Anastasiia Semenova, Minerva's ESG research manager and author of the defence briefing.
Hi, Jack. It's great to be here. So defence investment has become a hot topic in sustainable finance lately, and I'm glad that we're taking time to unpack some of the myths and real challenges that investors face in that space. As Jack mentioned, I put together a briefing to help clarify the regulatory landscape, highlight where the genuine red lines exist when it comes to defence investing, and explain why reputation and trust often play a bigger role than regulations alone when it comes to investments in the defence industry. So I'm looking forward to diving into the topic and hopefully demystifying some of the headlines around the ESG in defence.
Anastasiia, why has Minerva decided to publish this briefing on the compatibility between ESG practices and defence investments?
So as I said, defence investment is one of the most controversial debates in sustainable finance at the moment. Political narratives often blame ESG for blocking defence funding, but the reality of regulations is much more nuanced than that. In Minerva, we wanted to clarify what are the actual legal frameworks behind it, where true regulatory red lines lie, and how reputational risks rather than regulation are driving investment decisions in this space. Many large institutional investors right now decide that investing in defense companies doesn't exactly fit with their strategies or ethical standards, but it's important to recognize that regulations that are usually blamed by politicians are not the primary reason for those decisions. We are seeing a wider political pushback against sustainable finance regulation. For instance, there have been discussions about scaling back certain reporting directives, such as Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. ESG frameworks are sometimes unfairly blamed for broader economic and geopolitical trends. However, at the end of the day, it's investors' trust and market dynamics that drive capital allocation. Regulations simply set standards and transparency and accountability, but they are not necessarily the obstacles they are made to be in the headline, so we wanted to clarify that.
There are some misconceptions around the relationship between ESG, defence and regulation that the briefing highlights. What are the key misconceptions in this area?
So I would say there are two main misconceptions, and the first one is that all weapons are equally banned under the ESG frameworks. That's simply not true. The reality is that only certain weapons, which are banned under international humanitarian law, such as Class 2 munitions, anti-personnel landmines, chemical and biological weapons, these are true legal red lines in European sustainable finance space. Other weapons, such as conventional arms or even nuclear weapons, do not fall under the universal bans for sustainable funds. They remain largely at the discretion of the investors rather than outright legal prohibition. The second main misconception is even a broader one, is that the ESG rules ban defense investments outright. Again, simply not true. Defense as a sector isn't explicitly forbidden under most sustainable finance regulations. It can be included provided that there is a proper disclosure in alignment with fund objectives. But the absence of the ban doesn't automatically make defense sustainable. So legal permissibility of it and sustainability are not exactly the same. So defense industry remains ethically and politically charged space. ESG frameworks like Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive apply to all sectors, not just defense. These regulations require companies to identify adverse human rights impact, prevent and mitigate those impacts, and report transparently on how those risks are managed. Defense isn't being singled out unfairly. Similar standards apply to other industries such as agriculture, mining, energy, where human rights risks and environmental concerns also rise. That said, defense industry faces unique challenges. The sector operates in contexts with heightened ethical and political risks. Companies' main clientele are governments, which limits oversight on how end products might be ultimately used. This makes transparency and ESG compliance particularly complex in this space. So even though defense is legally allowed under ESG regulations, investors always must assess whether defense companies, clients or products could be linked to the breaches of international humanitarian law or human rights violations, as well as assess the reputational and ethical risks associated with such investments. So ESG sometimes is being blamed as an obstacle, but often bigger risks are reputational concerns, ethical considerations, and market expectations.
So what are the main considerations for institutional investors when it comes to defence?
Building on those misconceptions, there are three key practical considerations for investors. First, it's the reputational risks. Defense investments, even if legal, can attract negative public attention and stakeholder scrutiny. The second is human rights due diligence. Defense companies often operate in sensitive geopolitical contexts, selling to government, which makes oversight of the value chain extremely complicated. So robust human rights due diligence policies, as well as their effective oversight, are essential for those who choose to engage with this sector. And thirdly, regulatory and sanctions risk. Geopolitical development can quickly lead to new restrictions or sanctions being imposed on defense companies in investors' portfolio. So while defense is not legally prohibited under the ESG rules, investors must weigh whether such investments align with their values, fund objectives, and stakeholder expectations, and what are operational and reputational risks that are involved. So ultimately, it's about balancing the legal permissibility and risk management goals.
This year, several countries have withdrawn from the Convention on Cluster Munitions. How does the withdrawal of these countries create legal and reputational uncertainty for investors?
Yes, this year in 2025, several European countries such as Finland and Lithuania began withdrawing from Convention on Cluster Munitions, as well from the Ottawa Treaty, which covered anti-personnel landmines, due to security concerns and broader geopolitical issues. Legally, it fragments the landscapes investors are operating in. Even if countries withdraw, cluster munitions and anti-personnel landmines remain banned under many other jurisdictions and under various international norms. Reputationally, this move risks normalizing discussions around the weapons that long have been treated as unacceptable under humanitarian standards. For investors, this raises concerns about being associated with products that still carry significant ethical and public perception risks. This also increases complexity for pan-European funds. Investors must navigate the diverse regulatory landscape now. However, regardless of this political discourse, investors need to ensure their alignment with broader European norms and with the expectation of institutional clients who may choose to keep strict exclusion policies regardless of the legal changes in specific countries.
The defence briefing mentions Italy's 220/2021 law. For those who don't know, can you briefly explain the law, its 2024 update, and its impact on defence investments?
Sure. Italy's Law 220, which was adopted in 2021, bans financing of the companies that are involved in cluster munition or anti-personnel landmines. As of now, this is one of the most robust legislation in Europe addressing investment in these weapons. Earlier national laws in Europe banning these weapons financing were mostly introduced around the time when the Convention on Cluster Munitions was adopted, so around 2008. Those earlier laws mostly didn't address passive investment or index funds because at the time, those funds made up a very small portion of the market, so the legislation didn't look at them that much. Italy's Law 220, together with 2024 update, changes it. The legislation applies to all the financial products, including passive and Article 6 funds, regardless of whether they are ESG labeled. The law also requires internal controls and clear reporting requirements for the asset managers. It introduces clear supervisory mechanisms and a regulatory oversight process by the Italian authorities. And finally, it extends to foreign funds marketed in Italy. But more importantly, for foreign funds, local institutional investors in Italy are getting increasingly more cautious about investing in funds that might have exposure to these weapons. They now face potential regulatory consequences if their portfolios are later found to include exposure to cluster munition and anti-personnel landmines. So the practical impact is that asset managers, both inside and outside of Italy, must ensure that they have robust screening policies to avoid exposure to these controversial weapons, or they might risk losing the access to Italian institutional clients.
You just mentioned Article 6 funds there, and Article 6 funds have long held defence stocks, but it's rarer for Article 8 funds to do so. Do you expect Article 8 funds to increasingly embrace defence, and what impact could this have for investors?
Yes, there is a growing debate about allowing certain defense exposure in Article 8 funds, those promoting social and environmental characteristics, especially allowing the conventional weapons in it. We see that with our clients. Some asset managers are easing nuclear weapons exclusion, reflecting the geopolitical realities of the day. We expect that this may attract political support and might shift the market norms, but investors should be still cautious. Including defense in Article 8 funds raises reputational risks, especially in markets sensitive to the defense exposure. Adverse impact risks, again, defense products can be linked directly or indirectly to conflicts or human rights violations, as well as sanctions risks, particularly for companies operating in regions that are subject to shifting geopolitical tensions. So investors will need clear policies, robust disclosures, and to consider engaging with stakeholders if they choose to engage with the sector.
To summarise, what are the key takeaways of this briefing on defence?
Defense will remain a controversial industry, but more investors now are choosing to explore how to integrate it responsibly into their portfolios. Sustainable finance regulations aren't prohibiting defense, as the headlines often state. Transparency and trust are the bigger barriers. So the key takeaways probably would be ESG doesn't ban defense outright. There are clear legal red lines for certain weapons. Reputation and ethics remain critical risks when investing in this space. And investors that choose to engage with the sector need clear policies to navigate it.
Thank you for taking us through some of the briefing's key details, Anastasiia.
Thank you for having me here.
Minerva Analytics can support investors in aligning their portfolios with legal obligations, ESG frameworks, and stakeholder expectations. We can also help navigate decisions around controversial weapons, reputational risks, and national legislation demands. The Minerva Nexus framework offers ESG controversy screening, controversial product screening, and advisory services. You can find out more by visiting Minerva's website or by reaching out to us by email at hello@minerva.info. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter to be notified about new briefings and to see our weekly blog posts. Thank you for joining us.